And so tonight we're going to talk about learning, neurobiology, and the AUD reward system, but mostly we're going to talk about the basic mechanisms of learning. What are the cardinal features of learning? What are the cardinal factors that go into when we learn new information? And what we're going to find is that eyes has an awful lot to do with learning, and dopamine has a lot to do with learning, pleasure, and motivation. And I like this quote by Isaac Asimov. He said that the most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds the most discoveries, is not "Eureka, I found it," but "That's funny." And so the same with scientific discoveries. It's something that's surprising that causes us to learn new information. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. Let's see. And the person who discovered this was a fellow named Leon Kamin in 1968, in which he did an experiment that showed the Kamin blocking effect. I wonder if I have a prettier slide that shows that. Yeah, this one's a little bit more simple to understand it. And what he did was he did an experiment where he presented a light and a tone together to rats, and he gave them electric foot shocks, and the electric foot shocks elicited fear. And so for those of you who were around for session one, you'll remember that the light is a conditioned stimulus, one, the tone is a conditioned stimulus, two, the shock is a unconditioned stimulus, eliciting the unconditioned response, which is fear. And so what would you expect after several pairings of light and tone paired with shock? So if you do that, what you find is that if you present the light alone without the shock, you still get a conditioned response, which is fear. And the same thing, if you present the tone alone, you also elicit fear. So when you pair two stimuli associated with some unconditioned stimulus, you get conditioning to both stimuli. But what Kamen did was really interesting. He did the experiment a little bit differently. And first, he gave rats experience with presenting a light paired with shock. So he gave about 20 trials of that. And then he presented the light and tone together paired with shock. So now light and tone are both paired with shock. And then later he tested what happens when you present the light alone. And what you find is a conditioned fear response. That's what we saw in the first experiment. But what he did not expect to find is if you present the tone alone, there is no fear response. So even though the tone was paired with shock, if you tested the tone by itself, it did not elicit the conditioned response. It's as if the tone conditioning was blocked because the light had already formed an association with the shock. Stated another way, during phase one, the rat learned to associate, learned to expect getting shocked after the light was on for a couple of minutes. And so when the tone and light were paired together, the tone didn't add any new information in terms of predicting the shock. The rat already expected to get the shock, and the tone was just along for the ride. And then when you tested the light and tone by themselves, what you found was that the light continued to elicit a conditioned response, but the tone itself had no new conditioning, no new learning. Now, whenever I explain this model to people, sometimes it's difficult for people to understand and to grasp the significance of it. So I have a couple examples to try to show you a little bit more what I mean by this. And this is the Travis and Jason Kelsey example in terms of getting Taylor Swift to like them. So here we have an example where Travis Kelsey and Taylor Swift go out and enjoy movies. So they have a couple of trials of that. And sure enough, Taylor Swift learns to associate Travis with having a good time, and Travis becomes a conditioned stimulus, and Taylor likes Travis. So after a bunch of experience of going out with Taylor Swift and going to movies, then Travis says, "Why don't you, join me, brother Jason?" Jason is the center for the Eagles, and so the two Kelsey brothers go out to the movies and meet Taylor Swift there at the movies. I'm sorry. Here's an example where they have their podcast together. So they do the podcast together, and Taylor Swift listens to their podcast called New Heights. I don't know if anyone's listened to that, but it's a very good podcast. And so after the podcast, we ask the question, after who does Taylor like after the podcast? What does she enjoys the podcast? She has a good time. What does she attribute having a good time to? Well, because she already has associated with Travis with having a good time, she likes Travis. But she doesn't learn anything new about Jason. So she's feeling neutral with respect to Jason. Not particularly good, not particularly bad, just neutral. So Travis blocks his brother from forming any association to Taylor Swift, which is ironic because Jason is a center and he usually does the blocking. But in this case, Travis is the one who's doing the blocking for his brother. Now, hopefully that makes a little bit more sense, but I have even another example that I'd like to share with you. And this is an example of a situation where I have a friend named Justin. And so Justin was dating women, and he's making a little bit of money at the time, so he wanted to take his dates out to really nice restaurants. And so for a while he was trying to find out what his date really liked, and then he would take the date out to a nice restaurant, and the date would have a wonderful time. But then he kept winding up in the friend zone, if you will. The date said they had a great time and all that, but the date still just wanted to be friends. And so Justin came to me and said, "What can I do about this?" And I was teaching him about the Cayman blocking effect. So he tried a new experiment. And what he did was he started talking to a woman who lived why do we have these marks? I don't know. Any idea? No, I only have some marks. So he started talking to a woman who lived in California, and they were hitting it off pretty well. But instead of saying, "Oh, I'm going to take her to a nice restaurant and all that," he said, "The restaurant predicts a good time. And so when I'm present at the restaurant and my date has a good time, the date attributes the good time to the fancy restaurant, not to me. So I'm going to do something different." So he invites his friend that he's talking to in California to visit him in Philadelphia. And this girl in California is not particularly fond of snow, but she flies out to Philadelphia on February 10th, 2010. And you can see how happy she is that there's a big pile of snow there. In fact, if you look at the record, she came out during the second largest snowstorm in Philadelphia history. So there's 28 inches of snow that came to Philadelphia the weekend before that. So she was unhappy. She was not expecting to have a good time at all. Anyway, surprisingly, she had a good time. So guess what happened? So where's the associative strength being accrued there? To the crappy Philadelphia weather or to the date she was with? Well, here's the results of that experiment. October 23rd, 2010, she gets married. And of course, that's me. So understanding the important principle of the Cayman blocking effect, you can understand why you wind up in a friend zone or why you might wind up with a wife. Now, we can quantify all this with something called the Rescorla-Wagner model. And before I go into too much detail about this, I want to, again, tell you how science proceeds. And being around in the field for, as Steve likes to say, almost 50 years, I have some good stories for you about the people who developed these things. And I knew Bob Rescorla. I didn't know Alan Wagner very well, but both of them were at Yale at the time that this model was developed. And Bob Rescorla and Alan Wagner had offices which were on the same floor of the lab building. But at Yale, they tend not to collaborate very much. Now, at Penn, we used to collaborate all the time, but at Yale, they tend not to collaborate very much. Anyway, they're both invited to give a talk at a conference. And Bob Rescorla gets in a cab, and a cab driver asks, what are you talking about? And he starts talking about this mathematical model about how when an event is not expected, you're going to get stronger learning. So the cab driver said, oh, thank you very much. Dropped him off at the conference, went back to the hotel. And then this time he picks up Alan Wagner. And Alan Wagner's in the back seat, and he goes, well, where are you going? And he says, I'm going to this conference. And he goes, the cab driver says, well, that's interesting because I just drove someone who's going to the same seminar, the same conference as you. What are you talking about? And Alan Wagner's talking about how, well, the strength of learning depends on prior expectations. And if it's not expected, you learn more. And the cab driver says, well, that's interesting because that was the guy I just drove. That was his talk. And so Alan Wagner and Bob Rescorla had the same model, and they didn't know it until they gave talks at this conference. So after the conference, they get together and they write a couple of papers. One paper had Bob Rescorla as the first author. The other one had Alan Wagner as the first author. But this is the famous Rescorla-Wagner model. And it's really simple in its mathematics. Now, in preparation for tonight's talk, I went and I looked at YouTube to look at some the way some people describe the model and looking at the mathematics. And I'm not going to bore you with how complicated people have made this. So I'm trying to make it in a way that's really simple to understand. And after we do this, maybe we can take a little bit of time to make sure everyone understands this. And you can ask some questions and we can go through some examples. But the model is very simple in its execution. And it simply states that the new learning for stimulus A, so this is delta, the change in the value of stimulus A, depends on attention to stimulus A, which I call A here. I have a G there, but it should be an A. So that's the attention that you're paying to stimulus A, multiplied by the strength of the reward, so how reinforcing an event is, minus the expected value of the reward. So I hope people can understand that. So if you have a reward that's high, say 100, and you expect that you're going to get 100, this term subtracts out to 0. And so the change in learning is going to be 0. If there's a big difference here, learning is going to be high. You're going to learn something new. That's what this model says. And I want to give you some sort of quantitative examples of how you can understand this model. So let's look at an example of learning in which there's no blocking. So let's have a situation where the change in the association turns out to be 50. So here we have an example where what's the new learning for stimulus A if you're paying pretty good attention to stimulus A. So we'll give that a number of 0.5. The strength of the reward, 100, and the reward is unexpected. So the expected number here is 0. So what happens when you plug these numbers into the equation? You get 100 minus 0, which is 100, times 0.5, you get a change in the value of stimulus A of 50. So you learn a whole lot about how stimulus A is associated with some outcome, some reward. And what I'm describing can go for like rewards like getting tasty food. So stimulus A, if it's paired with tasty food and it's unexpected, the stimulus A accrues a lot of strength because it predicts the occurrence of food. So what happens in the blocking example? So here we keep the attention to stimulus A at 0.5. The strength of the reward we keep the same, which is 100. But now the reward is expected because there's already been pairings of maybe some other stimulus which already predicted that you're going to get the reward, or maybe there's already a lot of pairings with stimulus A is already predicting that you're going to get the reward. In the blocking example, there's some other stimulus B, that's predicting the reward. So this VE is the strength of all the associations which predict the reward. So in this example, the change in the value associated with A is going to be 0, which means that there's no new learning. So that's a quantitative way of looking at the blocking effect.
That's pretty cool. Can I take a stab at explaining this model?
Yes, please.
I understand it.
Yes.
Okay. Really, what you're saying, I think, is the change in the learning, or the new learning, if you will, is the product of two things: how much attention you're paying to it, and how much of a surprise there is in the expected reward.
Yes.
So that's it. That's all
That's it.
is. It's
That's
just
what this says. That's
it's
exactly
how
what
much
that equation says.
Yeah. How much am I paying attention to it, and how much did it surprise me? And if I was paying a lot of attention to it, which is probably my acetylcholine, and I'm surprised, then I'm going to learn something pretty quick.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if I'm paying a lot of attention to it, but it's not a surprise, I'm not going to learn a lot.
No. Or if it's a big surprise, but you're not paying attention to it, you still don't learn very much about it.
Right.
You're right. Two variables. If you're paying attention and if it's surprising.
Yeah. So, I mean, we could just call this like learning equals attention times
surprise.
The surprise.
Yes. Yes.
And then stick the blocking in there just so that that's clear. The blocking becomes no surprise.
No surprise. No surprise. And you can get no surprise because stimulus A already predicts it. So after you've had a whole lot of experience with something, if it's already predicted, you're not going to get any new learning. Or the more you predict it, the less you learn.
Right.
But the blocking is that there's some other stimulus, not stimulus A anymore, but some stimulus B that already predicts the occurrence of an event. And that blocks new learning to stimulus A.
So once now we take all this, and maybe you're going to walk us through this. What does this mean in terms of AUD? In terms of learning the AUD and unlearning AUD?
Well, I think we should take some time and open up the discussion and go through all that. But let me finish a couple more examples. And if you want, we can open up the floor and talk about how this may be relevant to AUD and the Sinclair method and Q extinction and all that kind of stuff.
Great.
But let me go through just a couple more examples to make sure people understand this. Because again, sometimes when you see this and you see math, you say, oh my God, there's math in it. But it's really not that hard. And Steve, you have you really have sort of the basic concept of what this is all about. Attention, time, surprise. So here's a situation where what happens if there's a reward that you expect, but it doesn't come? Let's look at the math. Again, we're paying pretty good attention. The strength of the reward now, though, is 0 because it never came. But you expected it to come. So the expectation was 100. So if you plug these variables into the equation, you have 0 minus 100 times 0.5, you get a minus 50. So now stimulus A goes negative. So you reduce its association with some reward. Now, then I would ask you, what does that sound like? You have a lot of experience doing something and getting a reward, but then you do something, so you block the reward. What happens to that association? And when I say stimulus, and to give you a clue, if I say stimulus, say, here I've been talking about conditioned stimuli, but it could also refer to operant behaviors. If you do something that leads to some good outcome, so you have an association between some behavior and some outcome, and all of a sudden you expect to get that outcome, but it doesn't come. What happens to the strength of the association between that behavior and that outcome? It's supposed to go down. What does that sound like?
Sounds like extinction.
Exactly. Exactly. This right here is the fundamental basis of the Sinclair method. Right there. That formula. Expected reward that doesn't come, that's blocked. You weaken the association between the behavior, picking up a drink, and the outcome, which is getting a positive effect from the alcohol. And then you can do it this way. What happens if you change the reward so that it's even stronger than you thought? So here you have experience getting, 100 units of pleasure from doing something. But now, instead of getting 100 units, it's 200 units. So plug in the numbers. Oops. Here, the strength of the reward. Oh, okay. Let's see. Did we go backwards?
Yeah, you went backwards.
Okay, there we go. So the strength of the reward is 200 minus expected reward 100 times good attention 0.5. You get learning again. So here, stimulus A maybe predicted some outcome at a reward of 100, but it was much stronger than predicted. So now the strength of that association gets even stronger than it was before.
Wow, this is really tough because if let's just say a person is genetically predisposed to be more sensitive to dopamine, then the strength of the reward is probably going to be always higher than the expected reward for a lot of things, which is why I think maybe the theory is that if a person can become addicted to one thing, they can become addicted to other things. Is if there's this inherent inflation, if you will, in the reward because of some genetic factor, then you're always going to be surprised relative to a person who's not.
Yeah, or here's another way to look at it. And again, I don't know if this is true or not, but let's assume that you're getting like 100 units of pleasure from doing something. And so you press a lever, you get 100 units of pleasure. And that's pretty good. But then there's other things over here that are giving you some units of pleasure. And so you press the lever a little bit, you pull a chain sometimes, you do a variety of things. But now all of a sudden you press the lever and you get 200 units of pleasure. That association gets stronger. What happens to all the other behaviors in the box? They're going to be interested in pulling the chain anymore? No. They're going to be interested in running in a shuttle bot? No. they're going to spend all their time pressing a lever for that 200 units of pleasure, because and the strength of that is really strong. So
And just to make sure that we cover this, reduction in pain is also considered to be pleasure in
that's correct.
this sense. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah.
So reduction in anxiety or depression or coming home and having a drink because I've had a stressful day.
Yep.
Is what we're talking about in that
Yes.
case. That's the reduction in pain equals pleasure kind of equation in that sense.
Right. And so someone might say, my stress is a 50, and so it's reduced by 50 units when I drink. And so the drinking behavior is reinforced up to 50 units. But then the person comes home after a really stressful day. And so now the drinking reduces the tension not by 50, but by 100. And then when the person drinks, they get, even more learning to the drinking behavior when they're stressed. And then we can even look at the stress as being sort of a conditioned stimulus for drinking behavior. So there's a variety of ways of breaking it down and analyzing it. But again, very simple equation, but really important implications as you change all these parameters. Let's see if we have anything else. Oh, and then we can talk about dopamine. But how about if we open the floor up to discussion to see what people think, if this makes any sense and if it resonates with people's experience at all?
Sure, we can do that. Do you want to uh, just let's give everybody the opportunity who doesn't want to be recorded to make sure that their camera is off. I think we're probably okay with that. And I think we've sanitized everybody's names too. So I think we're fairly good. There's some folks that have pictures on there. So if you don't want your picture to show up, you might just put your name. So let's go see what we got for questions here. Dave, you've got one. Why don't you fire away?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Dr. V. And so one of the things I'm interested in your thoughts on, so the way that the gambling industry sort of capitalizes on this model, I presume they've done a lot of research onto this, but the idea of a slot machine, and you could get a reward or you could not. You don't know which pull of the lever it's going to come on. And they seem to have just worked out that idea that we've got the right increments and enough of a surprise that it becomes an addictive experience. Is that consistent with your understanding?
Yeah, exactly right. We didn't talk about it, but what if the reward constantly changes? So one time it's 100, the next time it's 50, the next time it's 200. Well, each time you engage in the response, it's going to be surprising. And so typically when they set their reward conditions, it's most of the trials have a low probability of having a reward, but there's an occasional very big reward. And in people's minds, they think it's possible for me to get that big reward. And so that's it gets you excited for the possibility. And every once in a while it does hit, which has a strong effect in terms of really rewarding the behavior. Well, I'm going to give you another example of how the value of reward, and we're going to see this when we talk about dopamine itself, how the value of reward really depends upon how surprising it is in general. When I was growing up, my mother made really excellent spaghetti sauce. I mean, she would put it on the oven and cook it all day and put some meatballs in there. Great job. And every Sunday we would have spaghetti and meatballs. And objectively, it was great spaghetti and meatballs. But I knew I was going to get spaghetti every Sunday. And after a while, it was like, okay, I'm going to get spaghetti and meatballs, no big deal. And then I married that woman that you saw in the picture, who's from Swedish ancestry. And so her idea of meatballs is these little things that are not very tasty at all. And she would make spaghetti sauce by opening up a can of ragu. But she wouldn't make spaghetti every Sunday like I was used to growing up. She would do it every once in a while. And so when she makes spaghetti for me now, it really tastes great. This is fantastic. So the reward, if it keeps changing, continues to have the ability to produce pleasure. And a reward that's exactly the same time and time again doesn't produce as much pleasure. And we're going to find out that if you actually measure dopamine activity, when a reward is consistently predicted, it doesn't even stimulate increases in dopamine anymore. So by making the reward itself uncertain, keeps it exciting, you keep getting the dopamine. And you could probably think of other examples in your life where you get used to something. After you've been married for a bunch of years, certain activities which used to be really fantastic are just kind of good now because they're expected. So sometimes, if you want to keep the excitement going, and pulling the slot machine is one example, you want to make sure that the reward is unexpected. And you could do the following thought experiment to prove the point. Statistically, whenever you put $1 into a slot machine, you're going to get 86 cents back, something like that. If I set up a slot machine that every time you put $1 in, you got exactly 86 cents back, how long do you think you'd play at that slot machine? And statistically, those are the facts. But if I change the reward so that most of the time you don't get anything, but occasionally you get twice as much, maybe even once in a while you get 100 times as much, you love pulling the slot machine because you're getting that dopamine kick. You're getting this unexpected, and the reward comes. They have the lights go off. It's really exciting, and it feels really good. When you're pressing the lever, you anticipate, I might get that reward. So you're getting the dopamine going from that anticipation of it. And the whole experience is a lot of fun, even though ultimately you're only going to get 86 cents back on each dollar you invest. So what you're paying for is the surprise. You want the surprise. That's what makes the slot machine fun. And I maintain that's what makes life fun, is a surprise. Don't be shy about trying something new. Don't be shy about pushing the envelope a little bit. That's what makes life fun. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
It does. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you for that.
I know you're going to make this point on dopamine, that dopamine itself is not the reward. Dopamine is in anticipation of the reward. But what you just said really crystallizes the phrase, the thrill of the hunt. That's what it is, the thrill of the hunt.
Yes.
You are motivated by this unknown reward. We've got some other questions out there. Let's see. Benjamin, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself? Or maybe I got to unmute you.
No, I get it. Can you hear me?
Yeah, got it. Great. Go ahead.
So just kind of curious, because a lot of everything that we talk about is, removing the reward and things like that. But one of the things is we're always chasing that greatest reward that we had the first time. And then you get the diminishing returns, just like you enjoy that first chip. The first chip that you eat out of the box of Pringles is amazing, but by the time you get to the end, you're like, what did I do? This is awful. Very salty. Now my hand goes and stuck, just things like that. How is there a way to equate the inverse, like the removing the reward, like with, through the naltrexone and stuff like that, which I'm on and using and has helped me greatly. But how does that inverse equate to getting back to that initial, I don't want to say the initial rush, but just like removing the rush, I guess, maybe. It's kind
Yeah,
of hard
so
to put into words.
yeah, so in terms of chasing the dragon or chasing the high, a lot of people will remember the first time they got an unexpected reward and they got that 50 units of new pleasure, and they'll associate some behavior with that. And so they'll say to themselves, I want that again. That was really a lot of fun. And then the second time they do it, if you look at the math, they're only going to get 25 units of pleasure. And then it's 12 and a half. And so what keeps them going is the hope that they can get that 50 again. And then every once in a while, if they're doing heroin or something, somebody gives them an especially good dose of heroin that gives them that 200 units of pleasure, and they get that high again. So they're on an intermittent reinforcement schedule, and we didn't talk about that yet, but it turns out intermittent reinforcement schedules are very difficult to extinguish, because even if you have a trial where you don't get the reward, you don't give up right away, because in the past that sometimes if you keep trying, eventually you'll get that big high. Now, so then the second part is the inverse. So you're chasing the high versus chasing the sink of no pleasure, if that makes sense, as a high. Could you explain that a little bit more to me? I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, so I know like when I'm sober, I feel much better than even the high that I got from being drunk.
Yes.
But equating the sobriety to that same high, it's chasing a, to use your term, it's chasing a different dragon, if you will.
Yes.
But it's a different dragon. So it's hard to put into words, but like, how does the inverse apply to getting the sobriety to be the high?
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So I think one of the disadvantages that sobriety has is that it's associated with a variety of different behaviors. I assume this is true for you, that you probably enjoy spending time with people that you care about. You might even enjoy aspects of your work. You might enjoy following your fantasy football team. So there's a variety of things that give you pleasure. And if you're taking naltrexone, maybe the reward sort of peaks at 100. And so that allows you to experience the whole smorgasbord of things in life that are fun. So you have a variety of things to choose from, and that keeps it interesting because you don't get bored with one particular thing. If you do, there's something else you can do that's fun. So the overall pleasure in life, I think, is higher. When you get addicted to something, people tell me that after a while, they don't even enjoy the drug anymore, but they just keep doing it to avoid the pain, or because they get stuck in a terrible cycle where the reward is motivating them to continue in the behavior. And I was talking to Steve about this the other day, and we'll get to this a little bit when we talk about dopamine, but there's an experiment that they did with rats in which they put in electrodes into their brain, and when the rat would press a lever, the electrode would stimulate neurons in the brain that would release dopamine. And so the rat would learn to press the lever, and they apparently loved pressing the lever, because they would just go to town pressing the lever. In fact, when they were hungry, they didn't even stop pressing the lever to eat. When they brought in a sexy female rat, they didn't even stop pressing the lever to have sex. All they were interested all day was pressing the lever to get that reward. And you would think they must be in nirvana, they must be in heaven. This must be the most fantastic feeling that they have. But then they did the experiment where they said, okay, rats, if you go down this alleyway, you can turn left and go into that room where when you press the lever, you get the electrode giving you dopamine. Or if you turn right, you can avoid that room. And the rats all turned right. They didn't want to go into the room. And so I'm not sure that they were having that great of an experience, but there was something in there about that dopamine being released that compelled them to keep banging on that lever. And you could even do the experiment this way, where so you have the rats in the one room where they don't have the lever and they're perfectly content, but then you just give them a random jolt of stimulation on their electrode. So you get a little bit of a dopamine kick just randomly. They didn't do anything to earn it. They just got it randomly. All of a sudden they switch and they go into the room to get the lever for the dopamine. So it's just that little bit of dopamine primed them to get back in that, we would say, that addictive cycle where they had to keep pressing the lever. And that seems, go ahead.
Let me just make sure I understand this completely. Okay, so you had the rats that went into the room and they pressed away and were in nirvana. You took the same rats and you gave them the option to turn left into the room or turn right, and they decided, I don't want any of that dopamine. I'm going into the other room.
Yes.
Once they're in the other room, they got no dopamine, but you primed them with a little dopamine, and all of a sudden now they want to go back into the room that has the dopamine. Is
Yes.
that correct? Okay.
That's the
Just want to
experiment.
make sure I understood the sequence.
That's exactly the experiment.
Sounds like something I'd lived through.
it begins to have the flavor of what addiction is all about.
It sure does. Sure does. We have a question from Henry, and it's going to take us right back where we need to go, Henry. So I'm going to ask Joe to go right back into it. And Henry's question is with respect to he says reward expectation error, but I think he's really talking about reward prediction error, which is exactly the next topic that you're going to cover. So
somebody's paying attention, because this is exactly where we need to go. This is
exactly so
right.
We'll let you go right back into it.
Is this what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
You're right there. And reward prediction error, I don't know if Andrew Huberman talked about it today, is really derived from the Rescorla-Wagner model, the Cayman blocking effect, the whole notion that surprise is important for learning.
And now I just want to inject a personal note in here. Okay. While Alan Wagner and I are not at all related, I have a daughter, Margot Wagner, who is working for the third person that you see listed here on this paper, Terry Sedjanowski at the University of California, San Diego, is her graduate advisor. Small world.
So your daughter is working on something that flows directly from Cayman's blocking effect from 1968. So according to this hypothesis, reward prediction error, rewards that are expected do not produce a dopamine response in certain dopaminergic cells, but rewards that are unexpected or greater than expected produce a short-lasting increase in synaptic dopamine, whereas the omission of an expected reward actually causes dopamine release to drop below its background level. So this is the hypothesis, but there's empirical data that shows that this is exactly true. And so let me just sort of show this in a graphic form. If you're measuring dopamine activity and you have a reward that's not predicted, that's not expected, your dopamine level is at baseline, some cue might come on that doesn't predict anything, just some conditioned stimulus or some behavior that you emit, and then all of a sudden you get the reward, the unconditioned stimulus, a pellet of food. What happens to dopamine? Dopamine shoots up right after you get the pellet of food. But then you do the experiment where you have dopamine levels, but now you've had a bunch of trials where some cue predicted the reward. So a light will come on, and then a pellet of food would be delivered. And then if you measure dopamine levels, they increase during the cue, but not during the reward. They stay flat. And that's sort of counterintuitive, because a lot of people equate reward with dopamine, but here there's no increase in dopamine. All the dopamine is here for the cue. So what's negative prediction error? Yeah, baseline level of dopamine. Okay. And then you get a cue but there's no reward. So you expect the reward, but there's no reward. What happens? Dopamine levels go below baseline. Now, what does this look like in the Squirrel-Wagner model? This corresponds to the unconditioned stimulus having a positive effect. This is an example where the expected reward has now all the dopamine associated with the cue, not with the reward anymore. This reward ceases to be potent enough to teach you new tricks. It loses its ability. There's no dopamine kick anymore here. So it's not going to be something that is going to teach you a new behavior. It's no longer rewarding for something new. But God forbid you present the cue you expected and you don't get the reward. This in turn feeds back on here and reduces the cue's ability to elicit dopamine over time. This is like one of the hottest things in understanding addiction, understanding learning, even understanding how neural networks work in artificial intelligence and deep learning. They're using these concepts to teach computers virtually everything, how to diagnose cancer cells. You have a cue, and then if the computer is right and guesses correctly that it's cancer, it sends a signal back to all the cues that predicted it and strengthens those associations. If the computer guesses wrong, it sends a signal back to all the pathways that predicted it wrong and reduces their strength of being able to predict. This paradigm is incredibly powerful. And I would say what's interesting for me is that the people who use this are not the people in the field of addiction treatment, but people who are advertisers understand this, and people who are trying to teach computers to do things. So it's found its application, but not in psychology or addiction treatment. I remember, and this is a true story, I went up to Yale one time to talk with Bob Rescorla. And I said, the research you're doing is really fascinating, but you're making a mistake. You never apply this stuff to clinical phenomena. My thesis advisor, Marty Seligman, he applies learned helplessness to understanding depression, and he tries to make it relevant. And so his graduate students are going to be able to get research grants. And your graduate students are never going to be able to get research grants because you're not making it applicable to something that's important for people. And then, smart ass that I am, I said, you're going to be a dinosaur. Well, I was partly right and partly wrong. His graduate students weren't able to get grants. That's true. And the whole Rescorla-Wagner model sort of lost favor in the field of psychology. It never has really been applied systematically to understanding clinical phenomena like addiction. But I was wrong in the sense that there were people who picked up on all this. And I just want them to give proper attribution to the guys who developed it, even though you don't hear of them so much anymore. But people will talk about these concepts, negative prediction error, as if it's brand new and invented, but it really flows directly from the research that Kamen was doing with rats and Rescorla and Wagner were doing to try and quantify all that. And now we have empirical data that not only is this theoretically true, but we can show that it's true in functioning brains. There's a physiologic substrate for all this stuff. That's what's so exciting.
Just to give some optimism to what you're saying there, Joe, and you and I have discussed it, what my daughter is working at under Terry there is the application actually of this to building neural networks and using applied or artificial intelligence and machine learning to be able to predict depression. That's the first area that she's tackling with that.
But it's actually coming back to the mental health.
It is.
That is fantastic.
Yeah.
That's really good. So here's another example of the prediction errors and extinction, that you have no cue and there's an outcome and there's an increase in dopamine activity. You have a cue that predicts an outcome, increase in dopamine, no increase in dopamine when you get the outcome. You have a cue and no outcome, and you see the dopamine levels fall, and that reduces the cue's ability to elicit dopamine. So eventually, over time, this little peak gets smaller and smaller until the cue no longer has any increase in dopamine activity.
And when that line down there at the bottom flat lines,
yeah,
that's extinction.
that's extinction. There you go.
So we have it in the equation that you gave us, and we have it graphically here.
Let's see. Is there anything else? Let's see. Okay. So we can ask again, what does dopamine do in the brain? And when I hear people like Huberman and Anna Lemke talk about dopamine, it's often confusing, and hopefully I can help reduce some of the confusion. In the 1970s and 80s, we discovered that when someone does cocaine, there's an increase in dopamine in the nucleus accumbens in the brain. That's interesting. When you do heroin, there's an increase in dopamine in the nucleus accumbens in the brain. And then what they found is that for virtually every drug that people get addicted to, it leads ultimately to an increase in dopamine in the nucleus accumbens in the brain. So the theory was dopamine must be the pleasure neurotransmitter, particularly when it stimulates cells in the nucleus accumbens. But it turns out dopamine is much more complicated than that. And rather than just equaling pleasure, what dopamine seems to do is dopamine seems to motivate or energize behavior. It helps focusing your attention. So that alpha term in their score lobe model may actually increase with dopamine. It causes the organism that, if they've learned something, they want to continue to engage in it. It's that sort of compulsive, I have to do something. Now, it's probably the case that if you go from a low level to a high level of dopamine, that can enhance feelings of pleasure and reward. And here, I'm not sure if it's the dopamine itself or where the dopamine goes, what part of the brain is stimulated, because you can also get increases in dopamine activity when you're anticipating a negative event. So that sort of argues against that dopamine is just the pleasure hormone, because if you're fearful, if a tone comes on to predict shock, during the tone, you'll get an increase in dopamine. And so the way I look at dopamine is it mostly acts as a gain control, an amplifier. So whatever you're feeling, it makes it stronger. So if you're feeling pretty good, the dopamine is going to make you feel great. If you're feeling a little bit lousy, the dopamine is going to make you feel miserable. So it causes wider variations in your mood. And then I would ask the group, what mental health condition is associated with wide variations in mood, big highs, big lows? Steve, any theory?
Bipolar.
We get
What bipolar disorder. Somebody wrote it down here.
Yep.
Exactly. Bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder, in many respects, is a disorder of dopamine. That the highs and lows seem to be more exaggerated. Maybe even some personality disorders, like borderline personality disorder, is often described as having too many highs and lows, too reactive to things. You can be having a great time and feeling on top of the world one second, the next second you're just feeling miserable. So depending on the context, whatever you're feeling just becomes amplified. So that may be what dopamine does, is it more amplifies whatever mood that you're feeling at baseline. But it's important to look at increases in dopamine as opposed to the static dopamine levels. So that's important to keep in mind, that if the dopamine levels are high and stay high, that may not feel particularly good. And maybe that's our rats that are lever pressing for the cranial brain stimulation. They're pressing the lever so much that they're getting a constant high level of dopamine. So what's the only direction they can go? They can only go down. So that's the chasing the dragon thing. They may not even be bar pressing to get high anymore. they're bar pressing to avoid getting the crash from when the dopamine levels go down. So even though the dopamine level might be higher than before they even started bar pressing, because the direction of change is down, they feel awful. They may feel unmotivated. They may feel dysphoric. So the direction of the level of change of dopamine is really important, maybe more important than the absolute level of it. Low levels of dopamine are associated with reduced motivation and energy. And reductions in dopamine levels can dampen feelings of pleasure and weaken learned connections. So that's,
I think we do need to differentiate between two types of dopamine levels when we're talking about dopamine levels. One is the total dopamine pool that's available to for synaptic or tonic distribution.
Yes. Yep.
And then the other is the actual spike.
Yes.
Or dopamine level. And my understanding is that certainly with the AUD, that over time you deplete the pool of dopamine.
So that's that's a really interesting theory, that you don't get the spike because there's not enough dopamine to give you the spike. So that's a theory of why you habituate to the high associated with drinking. Mm-hmm. And the other theory is that the receptors for the dopamine become downregulated. So even if you do get a spike in dopamine, the brain doesn't see it because the receptors for it are not sensitive anymore. So those are two really interesting theories of why you get the tolerance.
All right.
So let me stop there, and we can be open to questions. Or
we do have some questions. So let me just take a look here, or you could see too, I suppose. One thing I wanted to talk about was this intermittent reward pattern and non-compliance using naltrexone.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what can you tell us about that?
Well, so based on our Rescorla-Wagner model, if you take naltrexone right before you engage in the operant behavior, the instrumental behavior of drinking, and then you drink and you don't get the expected high that you would normally get, then that should produce lower levels of dopamine, and by the Rescorla-Wagner model should reduce the strength of the drinking behavior. So that's regular behavioral extinction. But then what happens, you ask the question, suppose someone now has been doing the Sinclair method for a period of time. So they take the naltrexone and they drink, but now they're not really expecting to get much of a buzz, right? So they get an unexpected reward from drinking. What's that going to do to the drinking behavior?
Usually it goes off the rails.
It goes off the, and the Rescorla-Wagner model would say, you're expecting a 0 and you get an unexpected plus. That's going to be like the very first time you drank.
Right.
It should go off the rails. That's what the model would predict. I don't know. What are the data?
The data supports what the model predicts. I don't think there's anybody that goes non-compliant that comes back and has a good tale to tell. They're usually a tale of learning is really what it ends up being. We tell folks that probably the most important rule of all is compliance with the medication. That being said, almost everybody seems to experiment. And when they do, it usually is not fun. So usually it's a one and done. Some people do more than that, and some people never do it. But
yeah, and so then I see this come up like sort of every time we meet, where people say, should I do naltrexone every day, or should I just do it in a targeted way? And there's advantages and disadvantages of each approach. But if you do it every day, then you're not going to have the issue of not using naltrexone before you go out drinking because you've done it every day. And this can happen, that I have patients who want to test the model to see if it works. So when I say if you drink alcohol and you're on naltrexone, you're not going to get a buzz. And like in the original study that I did, I found that the naltrexone wasn't particularly effective in getting people not to have the first drink, because a lot of people said, I really don't believe that. And so they would go out and test it. Because they were taking naltrexone every day, they didn't get the high. And so instead of having an episode where they would have 5 drinks or 10 drinks, they would have 1 or 2 drinks and stop. If you do the Sinclair method and you don't take the naltrexone and then you go out and drink, the alcohol should be really rewarding. So that slip won't be just 2 or 3. That slip is going to be 10. So that would be one advantage of doing it, taking the naltrexone on a daily basis. On the other hand, if you want to get really pretty extinction, the Sinclair method is better. You explicitly pair the response with the lack of reward. Okay. And so that feeds back on the response to really weaken that response. So that might be an example where the targeted approach is better. So again, it could go either way, and the model predicts various outcomes depending on how we interpret it.
So that's in really particularly stubborn cases that logic then carries over to why a person would maybe, for example, take the Vivitrol shot and then use targeted naltrexone when they're actually drinking. So
Yes.
A combination of the two for a
There you
really
go.
pernicious AUD. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Good point. Yep.
Let's see here. We've got question about extinction burst. DC, I'm going to let you ask that question yourself if you want to, or I'll ask it for you. Or, I mean, it's in there, but do you want to go ahead and ask?
Yeah, it's just generally I don't hear much talked about it on TSM, but I feel like there was this weird phase that I went through. Like I said, around week 19, all of a sudden I became manic. I was just consumed with thinking about alcohol. So I was fine. I just would, take my pill, have a couple drinks, and then I realized, and then quickly it was low volume. And then just to add on to that, about a month later, I did dry January. And then after that, I, have the freedom from alcohol. So just curious, extinction bursts, what do you know, or what do you think about them?
Yeah. So if you do an experiment with rats and you train them to press a lever to get food pellets, and then you change the paradigm so that they press the lever and they don't get the food pellets anymore, the rats will go through extinction. But if you look at the pattern of how they extinguish, you don't find that there's just sort of a gradual reduction in the responding for food. What you see is that they press the lever, don't get the food, and they act kind of upset about that. So they become a little bit emotional. And so some of the rats will start walking around the cage, and then someone will hit the lever and say, "Where's my pellet?" And they start banging on the pellet, the lever a bunch of times. Come on, this thing must be broken. What's going on? And then eventually they extinguish. But it's usually not like a nice, consistent pattern where it's monotonically decreasing over time, that there's these little bursts that suggest that the animal is upset that they're not getting their food pellet. So I don't know if that's what you had, but it would be interesting to look at these situations with these tools in mind to try to understand what might be going on. When I hear the word manic, the first thought that comes into my head is dopamine. So was there something going on that was increasing your overall level of dopamine at the time? I don't know. Let's see, extinction bursts, real thing. So you can get regular extinction bursts just from regular old extinction. But if it's occurring week 19 or 21, I would wonder if there's something else going on in your life that's getting that overall dopamine levels up a little bit higher than usual. And it could be something that you're really looking forward to. It could be something that's stressing you out.
Yeah, and this was all during the holidays last year, so I didn't journal as I wish I would have, but yeah, there could have been some other things going on. Okay, well, that was just interested to know your thoughts and just that on that topic.
So if I understood your answer there, Dr. V, what you're saying is that if there is an extinction burst, you would expect that that kind of behavior or those bursts would happen earlier in the process rather than later.
Yes.
And that if it's happening closer to a person reaching extinction, there might be some other influence that has just kind of worked its way in temporarily there.
Yeah, and I don't know if people remember, but in the very first seminar meetup, I talked about spontaneous recovery. I don't know if anybody remembers that craft, but if you extinguish like a conditioned stimulus, so the rat's not responding when the light comes on, and then you wait a day or two, put the rat back in the box, and then you present the light again, there seems to be some return where the conditioned stimulus is effective again. It can still elicit the conditioned response. So just the mere passage of time can cause the connection to sort of rear its ugly head again, if you will. So someone who maybe is using the Sinclair method where they undergone extinction, but now they're not drinking at all. So they go a couple months without any drinking. And then they walk into a bar or some situation where alcohol is available. They might be disappointed to find that their craving has come back. And that's just a spontaneous recovery.
Yeah, that's a little different, I think, than what's being described here. I think, and the reason I'm dwelling on this is because I know I've been guilty of saying this to people when they're getting close to extinction and they've had an excursion, let's call it that, and you tend to be upset by that. Then we usually will mollify them by just saying, "Hey, that's probably an extinction burst. That probably is actually a good sign. It says that you're probably coming to the end and you're going to hit extinction pretty soon." But what I hear you saying is that that might not actually be the case. And I want to be really careful with this because the one thing we don't want to do is get people discouraged at the, when they're almost at extinction and they have an extinction burst.
Right. So your advice, I think, is right on the mark, but maybe not for the reason that you're giving it.
Okay.
But when someone's having an extinction burst, they might be really disappointed in themselves. They might be upset. They might be emotionally aroused. And remember, I said that when you're energized, when something unexpected occurs, all these things tend to increase levels of dopamine. And the increased levels of dopamine may be helping to fuel that sort of emotional response where the person now is engaging in certain behaviors because they're just all jazzed up because their dopamine levels are high. So it could be something like that. And your advice to say, hey, calm down. It happens. Don't beat yourself up. Relax. That helps the dopamine levels come back down and will be beneficial for their overall recovery. So the advice, I think, is right on the mark to get people less emotional, but it may be just a general effect of just calm down. Don't get angry with yourself or angry with anyone else.
Okay, but it could also be one more piece to that too, which is maybe there was something there that triggered you, okay, that you weren't aware of. And so that's just kind of a message to, increase the attention part of the equation, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a really good point that some people use drugs and alcohol as a way of not thinking about things, of reducing salience of other really important things in life. And then when you take away the alcohol, then there's room for the attention to be paid to those events. And some of them might be upsetting in their own right. So it's important to address those things. So
let's see here. Okay. Karen's got a question. This is kind of a broad question. She says, how would you describe the relationship between naltrexone, endorphins, and dopamine?
Sorry, I can chime back in on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my daughter was distracting me for a while, so I saw like bits and pieces, and then I heard more of this discussion, and I'm guessing it's going to be addressed later on. And I know it's a broad question, but yeah, so if you want to say, hey, that's going to be another thing, cool. But yeah, that was my question.
Well, I can answer that very simply. So alcohol stimulates the release of endogenous opiates. Now, it tends to do that more in some people than others. Particularly if you have a strong family history, we can measure the endorphin levels and they go up in certain parts of the brain. When endorphin levels are higher, it tends to take away the inhibition of dopamine. So the net effect is it increases dopamine levels, particularly in those reward pathways that I talked about. So if you take naltrexone and you drink the alcohol will still stimulate the endorphins, but now the endorphins won't have any effect downstream. So when the endorphins then try to bind to endorphin receptors, they can't bind to it anymore. So there's no increase in dopamine when you drink. That's how it works.
So I know this is massively oversimplifying, but then if we think about dopamine as a learning tool and not necessarily pleasure, would the endorphins be causing the pleasure? So could you still feel the pleasure, but then not have that learning? Or
your body doesn't even feel the endorphins because
it doesn't.
They can't bind to anything. So you don't
Okay.
get pain relief. You don't get any pleasure from the endorphins. Just they're floating around, not doing anything.
Okay. So like when people talk about like running and, having the endorphin effect or, the cold plunge or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it like, to me, I hear like the pleasure that comes following that. So what causes that?
Yeah. So the natural stimulus for the release of endorphins in your body is pain. So if you do something that causes pain, your body's going to release endorphins. Now, the pain part might not be so much fun, but getting the endorphins might be fun. And so particularly during situations where maybe you're craving a little bit of stimulation, some good endorphin effect, something like the cold plunge would hit the spot. And again, for people who like incredibly hot, spicy foods, I think part of why they like them is they get some sort of endorphin effect. And there's even some theories that things like people who go around cutting themselves, chronic cutters, they're doing that because they're getting an endorphin effect. So something that causes pain can stimulate endorphins.
So but the endorphins aren't causing the pleasure, or?
Well, again, in some people, the endorphins will remove inhibition on dopamine, so the dopamine levels go up. As the dopamine levels go up, that during the rising phase of it, that can feel pleasurable. But what it also does is it helps learn the behavior. It cements in that behavior that caused the dopamine to increase in the first place. So if the person was cutting, it cements that as an activity. If the person's jumping in a pool, it cements that. So you learn that this activity causes the increase in dopamine.
Okay. And so the increase in dopamine can cause pleasure. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Awesome. That's what I needed. Thank you.
It's a dynamic effect, change over time. Or if you're mathematically inclined, it's the first derivative.
Yeah. Calculus-based
says,
physics.
you promised there would be no math.
Thanks, Dr.
All
B.
right. Claire, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. So yeah, my question was in regards to bipolar disorder. And so, oftentimes we hear the kind of term self-medicating, but I think it really applies quite aptly to bipolar disorder. So because alcohol is a depressant, it can often kind of prevent people who experience mania or hypomania on a regular basis. It can prevent that from occurring. But then in the absence of using alcohol to kind of maintain that, somewhat depressed effect, then when mania kicks in or hypomania kicks in, then they'll overdrink. And then, with that overdrinking and that mania, might come the other consequences of the other effects and other behaviors that are associated with mania. So I guess my question would be, with regard to TSM in particular, is there any kind of advice that you would give that might be specifically applicable to people with bipolar disorder, given the fact that they're kind of might be using alcohol to serve kind of two different purposes, I guess.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And people with bipolar disorder have a much higher incidence of AUD. It's just a fact. And for the patients that I've treated, often I found that their drinking would increase during hypomanic or manic phases. And so this is typically for people who maybe had the strong family history for AUD, and they start getting a little bit of that manic-y feeling, so they get that dopamine going. And what's that do? That creates the need for more dopamine. And so they can enhance their mania by drinking alcohol. And it works initially. But then as the alcohol wears off and they start losing the dopamine, they want to do something else to get that dopamine going. So they're engaged in a constant struggle to keep that dopamine going.
Right.
So that's the dopamine effect. Now, alcohol, as you point out, is a CNS depressant, and that's for everyone. So I can imagine some people might instrumentally learn that, oh, I'm getting a little bit too manic-y. I need something to chill out. And so they might use alcohol instrumentally, not because of addiction, but because they know it has this kind of pharmacologic effect as a way of trying to chill their manic episode by taking a depressant. And that might even work initially. But as the alcohol wears off and you go through withdrawal, you're not in a depressed state anymore, but you're in a rebound hyperexcitable state. So you're again stuck in that vicious cycle where now you have to keep drinking to avoid getting too manic-y. What I find, which is really interesting, I've had several patients who had AUD, but when they were profoundly depressed, they had bipolar disorder and they were in a profoundly depressed phase, they didn't even like alcohol anymore. So they lost interest in all enjoyable activities, including drinking. And the drinking mostly occurred when they were feeling manic-y. So the relationship between mania, bipolar disorder, and AUD is a really interesting one. There's clearly some association there, but how everything works together, we still need to study it and to understand.
And I guess like the question, or as a follow-up question, that was very helpful to kind of connect that all together. But it would seem to me that if someone with bipolar disorder was drinking on a daily basis, and then started to introduce alcohol-free days, where then that kind of, mania can, as you said, like hyperexcitability, can kind of sneak itself in. Is there anything else that you could add to, kind of making that change in trajectory of, daily drinking to having alcohol-free days, but in some way protecting against the hyperexcitability or resultant mania that might kind of happen as a result of just introducing those periods where the brain isn't so depressed?
Yeah. So as you can imagine, if you already are manic-y, introducing alcohol just complicates the clinical course. Those are probably times when it's really best to not drink. or if you're going to drink, not have more than one drink. But
Mhm.
so mixing alcohol during mania is really a bad thing, either because of its sedative effects and rebound excitability from the sedative effects, or because you're getting the dopamine kick if you have the gene for the endorphin dopamine effect. That's really a bad strategy if you have mania. So alcohol plus mania, bad combination. That's when I would do my a series of alcohol-free days. So that may not be what you're
Within the context of the mania.
right. During that phase, better to probably abstain from alcohol altogether until the manic episode is over.
And how would you dampen the mania?
So I would use medicines that are anti-manic. So I would probably use the combinations of mood stabilizers, which look an awful lot like medicines that I use to treat alcohol withdrawal symptoms. So things like Tegretol and Neurontin. I even use things like lithium, and there's other mood stabilizers. It's typically they're the atypical anti-seizure medicines are really helpful to help stabilize mood. And when someone's in an acute manic episode, I would do something that blocks dopamine. So something like Abilify, Seroquel, something like that. So that would be the approach.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, doctor. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I guess the other thing is that when you have a case like that, it's really important to keep close communication, because the landscape's changing all the time under that condition.
Yes. Yeah. Everything is happening dynamically. Things are going up and down. It's really a very sort of dangerous period for the person. And it's better to remove one of the variables, which is the alcohol drinking. So if someone's practicing TSM, I would probably suggest that they use the naltrexone for sure, but don't drink on top of it.
Yeah.
That's not the time to do extinction trials. That's time to just stay away from the alcohol.
Yeah. Megan, would you like to pose your question?
I mean, do we have anyone here who has bipolar disorder, or be interested to hear what their experience is? Well, it would, I'm always interested in getting people's experience so I can learn from all this too. So
I'm happy to share. Actually, I have bipolar disorder. And I would say for me, I have bipolar 1. So for me, it's actually, I can remember times when I was really full-blown manic and I wanted to drink to keep it like, to just chill out, because I
Yes.
couldn't sleep and I couldn't, I couldn't function. But now that I've been stable for many, many years, I think actually what kind of led me to overdrink and to actually come to like to believe that I did have a problem with alcohol was I had a manic episode in 2019, and I thought I was like good for so many years that it would never happen again. So like that episode actually made me so depressed that that's when I really started over drinking. So I would say that it's just, it's different for different strokes, different folks, right? Like, but bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 I just think they're so different in so many ways. Like, yeah, there's a lot of similarities, but there is so much that's different and I also work in mental health. So I see like lots and lots of people, with different stories and situations, but, yeah, there's definitely, a correlation. And, but I also think too, like fortunately, I've been on a mood stabilizer during the whole time I was drinking. So it actually would stop me from drinking too much, I think. So it was kind of like the Mediterranean style drinker. Like I wanted to have at least a couple glasses of wine every night, but I didn't usually ever go like past a bottle because I would just get way too sick because I was taking medicine. So, but, I wanted to mention that I actually do homeopathy treatment too. And that has been like amazing for me. So if you can find someone who does specific like homeopathy for mental health, that can be really helpful for like the nuances of the mood swings and things. So
That's great. So did you find that alcohol was more pleasurable during manic episodes or when you were depressed?
Oh. Pleasurable, I would say, when I was manic and having fun, but I don't think I intentionally overdrank. I was just like having fun, partying, socializing, right? Whereas when I'm depressed, or when I was depressed and it became a problem, it was like, I need to have alcohol because otherwise, because I just need to like escape from this feeling. Even if it's a more depressed feeling, it's still a feeling that's different from my current reality. So, yeah, I don't know if that
So,
answered your question.
well, let me play this back to make sure I understand it. So when you were manic, it's I like to drink. And when you're in the depressive side of it, it's I need to drink.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, absolutely.
I agree.
Yep.
Hmm.
Thank
Good,
you for
thank you.
bringing this up.
Well,
It's a good,
thank you for
helpful.
sharing that information. Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Back to Megan.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I know in one of the other slides, not this time, but last week, I think one of the main pillars of AUD is impaired control. And one of that pillars is difficulty stopping. So I'm just wondering, like how that relates to the behavior learning. Because I've never had an off switch, so I'm just wondering if my brain learned that or if it's genetically because I get like strong reinforcement from endorphins. I'm just kind of wondering how that works. I'm a bit confused.
Yes, when people have difficulty within a drinking session of controlling how much they drink, it makes me think that their brain is particularly wired to get the endorphin dopamine effect from alcohol. So that when you get that increase in dopamine, that feels good, but the dopamine levels then gradually start to fall down. So you need to drink more to get the dopamine levels back up. And so that creates a pattern where one drink creates the need, the desire to have the second, third, fourth, and fifth drink. For people who drink for the sedative effects of alcohol, or people who get physically dependent on alcohol, I think that's sort of a different mechanism that they're drinking to take away or prevent withdrawal from the depressant effects. And that's where your body gets hyper excited and it produces the classic withdrawal symptoms. So there, the person needs to drink alcohol to avoid withdrawal. And that's helps explain why if you drink 5 days in a row, you want to drink the sixth day. So the one is a mechanism for why you want to have the sixth drink. The other is a mechanism for why you want to continue drinking day after day. So two slightly different mechanisms to explain two different patterns of behavior. What you're describing with where you don't have the off switch, that sounds like a endorphin dopamine effect. And when the dopamine levels are high, people tend to be really energized, motivated, almost obsessive with whatever behavior caused the dopamine levels to go up. And so that would be what I would wonder. And I would predict if you have that pattern, naltrexone should be especially helpful for you to turn off that off switch or turn on the off switch.
Thank you. That makes so much sense because I've always said like alcohol felt like a drug to me. Like it could make me stay up all night. I had endless energy and like a lot of my friends didn't. So that makes sense. Thank you.
It's biology.
Yeah.
Dave, I don't want to miss your question because I think it's a good wrap-up question, actually, and we're almost out of time for this evening anyway. But why don't you go ahead and pose that?
Sure. Yeah, and I'm happy for it to roll over to next week if it involves a longer response, Dr. V. But Anna Lemke talks a lot in her work about it, using a dopamine fast from addictive behaviors or substances. So the example she uses in her book is a person studying computer programming who cannot get motivated to do their study, but they're playing 6 hours of first-person shooter video games. So highly dopaminergic video gaming, and they just can't get the motivation or the dopamine responding to their study, which is so boring in comparison. So she's saying 30 days to kind of restabilize your dopamine levels. Does compliant drinking satisfy that idea of a dopamine fast because you're getting the negative reward prediction? It's almost better than a fast. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of a dopamine fast is that you can get a better reward prediction error when you do get the dopamine. So if the levels are low, the only way they can go is up. So things are going to feel a lot more pleasurable after you've had the fast. If the levels are chronically high, the only way you can go is down. So you're not going to get much of a kick for doing things. And then if you're not doing the thing that got the dopamine levels up to begin with, you're going to feel dopamine withdrawal, which is going to feel like blah, not motivated, don't feel like doing anything. Let's see. So to answer your question, I don't know. Can you repeat the last part of your question? I want to make sure.
Yeah. So the key part there was, is drinking on naltrexone effectively like abstaining from a dopamine perspective, or almost even better? So you could abstain from alcohol for 30 days to satisfy her model, but
Yes.
compliant drinking is almost effectively abstaining because you're blocking the endorphin reward in the middle of that chain.
Yeah, you're effectively blocking the dopamine. Yeah. So if you do compliant drinking with naltrexone, you're not going to get that dopamine kick. So you're still doing a dopamine fast.
Perfect. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Great. Well, we're coming to the end of our 90 minutes. I wanted to go back to this formula one more time that you had put up there about learning. And just to make a point, the learning, what we said was that learning is a product of attention and the difference in the expected reward and the actual reward.
Yes.
Okay. So
Perfect.
the difference in the actual reward and the expected reward may or may not be in our control. You know, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. One thing that's definitely in our control a lot of the time is how much attention we pay. Okay, so if it's a product of the attention times the reward that we're getting, or the difference in the reward, let's say, I think that just points out the kind of importance of mindful in the term mindfulness. That by paying attention to these things, and I guess really what I'm really getting at is that there's a lot of behaviors and habits and things that we have brought along with us in the development of our AUDs. Okay, and we want to shed those things, and the naltrexone helps us to do that on a biological basis, but on a psychosocial basis, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we don't, that we still have to address. And it seems to me that a big part of this is the attention that we give to those things. So I think that formula has it's got a lot of stuff packed inside of it. And so I would really encourage people to just think about that formula and think about learning and think about unlearning, and how do you use that formula in terms of behaviors and habits and unwinding the situation. Thank you, Dr. Jeff.
Thank you.
It's been a wonderful evening. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, sir.
We'll look forward to next week.
Thanks, Dr. V.
Thanks.
Oh, Henry, we'll put the formula. We'll make sure the formula is in the notes on Discord. We'll make sure the presentation's up there. The formula will be in there, and you can perform all the calculus on it that you like. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dr. B. Thanks,
Thank
Steve.
you.
Have a great evening, folks.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.